From making you hate your house's basement to making you look twice at a nun whenever you cross one, horror films really keep you on the edge, even after you're done watching them. And it's no wonder why The Sinister from 2012 was considered one of the best horror movies of that year. For starters, the movie was well received by critics and audiences alike, and it's still considered one of the most terrifying films of 2012. And there are a bunch of reasons why Sinister is the perfect horror movie. One of the major ones is definitely the film's use of atmosphere and tension. Think about it. The film takes its time to build a sense of dread, and the tension gradually increases as the story unfolds. Not to mention, the cinematography and sound design are also used perfectly to create an eerie and unsettling atmosphere, the one we all hate and love at the same time. But of course, the main selling point is the story of Sinister. The film centers around the discovery of a box of old home movies, which contain footage of grisly murders. But I'm not going to give you any spoilers in case you haven't watched it yet. With that said, here's another fan favorite, The Conjuring from 2013. Again, like most films on this list, The Conjuring is a supernatural film, directed by James Wan and written by Chad Hayes and Carrie W. Hayes. It's based on the true story of the Perron family, who moved into a farmhouse in Rhode Island in the 1970s and experienced terrifying supernatural events. Not to mention, The Conjuring is considered one of the most popular horror films of 2013 because of its effective use of classic horror tropes. But the biggest reason why audiences liked The Conjuring is that it was marketed as a true story. The film was basically based on the real-life experiences of the Perron family. I'd actually consider it one of the contenders for one of the greatest horror movies of all time. But let's move to 2014, Antagonist coming out of a children's book. Sounds silly, doesn't it? Well, that's until you actually watch it. The Babadook is actually a psychological horror film, and it does everything to prove that it's exactly that. The movie tells the story of a single mother named Amelia and her young son, Samuel, who is plagued by a monster from a children's book. It's a great movie that goes above and beyond just the elements of horror, but you wouldn't go wrong with 2015's It Follows either. The movie tells the story of a teenager named Jay, who is pursued by a supernatural entity after a sexual encounter. The entity takes on different forms and relentlessly follows her until she can pass it on to someone else. But if you want the full experience, you'd obviously have to go watch it yourself. And there's a reason why the movie is praised for its innovative premise, tense atmosphere, and use of subtle visual cues to create a sense of unease. Hands down, one of the best horror films from 2015. But how about some Anya Taylor-Joy in the mix? What? You thought she could only play roles such as in The Queen's Gambit? Well, you might be a little off, because her performance in The Witch from 2016 was actually one of her greatest performances. No wonder it has a 90% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. And if you're a fan of period films, you should get even more excited, because The Witch is exactly that. The movie is set in 17th century New England. It follows a family that is exiled from their Puritan community and begins experiencing strange and terrifying incidents. On top of that, it also talks about religious extremism and witchcraft allegations from that time. A great watch if you ask me. But what's your guess for the best from 2017? Sorry to burst your bubble, but this time around, my award for the best horror movie goes to a French-Belgian horror film. Surprised? Well, you shouldn't be, because there are so many other films made around the world that are just too good to be missed. Contrary to popular belief, the world doesn't revolve around Hollywood, and the film Raw tells the story of a young vegetarian who attends a veterinary school. She's forced to confront her own carnal desires after a hazing ritual goes wrong. You see where this is going? Yeah, I stopped before it got any more explicit, just so that if you're not into that kind of stuff, you could just move on. Speaking of which, one of the movies I've mentioned is making a comeback on the list. How about going back to the Conjuring universe for 2018? Oh yes, it's a whole thing with those films. What? You thought only Marvel and DCEU could do it? Well, here you have it. The Nun follows a priest and a novitiate who are sent by the Vatican to investigate a mysterious suicide at an isolated Romanian abbey. The film is criticized for its lack of originality and reliance on jump scares, with many reviewers finding it to be a weak entry in the franchise. Having said that, it's important to know that 2018 was a weak year for horror films overall. But if you still need something really crazy, I'd say go for Hereditary from the same year. I just really hope and also believe that the next part, Nun 2 that's coming soon, will be one of the greatest horror films of all time. Why? Because the writers ought to learn from this experience and will realize that they're also the ones who wrote The Conjuring. But let's forget about that and focus on Midsummer from 2019 for a second. Were you planning on going to a Midsummer festival in the coming days? Well, I'd suggest watching this movie. It'll definitely make you think twice before going. And you might be wondering why I'd want that. And my answer would be that that's exactly the fun of this genre, don't you think? Because the movie tells the story of a group of friends who travel to a remote Swedish village to participate in a midsummer festival. But instead of a peaceful trip, they discover a sinister pagan cult. What unfolds next is for you to watch and see. Remember those Paranormal Activity movies from back in the day? Those were something, weren't they? And that's exactly what Post from 2020 tried to achieve. It's a found footage horror film directed by Rob Savage. The movie takes place during the COVID-19 pandemic and follows a group of friends who host a seance over Zoom that goes terribly wrong. To release the movie in such troubling times may have not been the best idea, but looking back at it now, I'd say it's a great watch. Again, for 2021, Rob Savage went for the camera footage kind of horror film. The movie is entirely filmed through the lens of either Annie Hardy's handheld iPhone or the dash cam in her car, as she broadcast her actions live to an online audience. The comments of those are visible on the screen. The plot centers around Hardy, who portrays a partially fictionalized version of herself. She travels to London during the COVID-19 pandemic to visit a friend, but her life takes a terrifying turn after she offers a ride to a mysterious woman. The film follows Hardy as she navigates a series of chilling events that leave her questioning her own sanity and safety. Again, this is in no way as good as some of the earlier entries, but you've got to consider how this was the best we could have at that time. So for 2022, Terrifier 2 follows the old and classic clown killer formula. After being brought back to life by a malevolent force, Art the Clown makes his way back to Miles County. His intention of instilling fear in the hearts of a teenage girl and her younger brother on Halloween night? Why? I don't know. But do horror movies really make sense all the time? No, they don't. Terrifier 2 is also a little reminiscent of It, but not really. Just watch to find out. And there you have it, some of the best horror films from their respective years.